Is this where you want it? Whoa, is that where you want it? Okay. Good morning, everyone. The few of you that are left. Actually, that doesn't bother me. My uncle used to say, if one person shows up and you have something to offer, you should share it with them. Don't feel bad if there are a few numbers. But who can complain when I wasn't here at the first meeting? So, you know, I did have a good excuse. I wasn't going to tell you, but I thought I would. But I took Diane to urgent care because her persist. We've had a cough for a month, both of us, and it got a little worse. And then her eyes started burning last night, and her throat started getting sore and swelling up. So we went to urgent care this morning. So that's probably a legitimate reason to skip chapel. But I know that whenever I do that, I happen to be standing back there when John says, if he shows up, that's who's going to speak. And I, uh, I think I'm the only one they ever say that about. So that's pretty pitiful. On, if you know me, and maybe you don't know me this part, but if I'm if I'm scheduled to speak on a holiday like Easter, Christmas, Mother's Day, Father's Day, the other guys that speak know that I will not speak on that holiday subject. I don't like doing holiday subject. And so Jerry, I think it was Jerry or John had made the suggestion that they were going to assign me Easter. And I said, that's no problem. I said, I'll be glad to give a message on Easter, but it will be called Esther, which is close, but not the same. And so if you'll turn to Esther, we're going to continue the lesson that we've been doing sometime in the past. And I will re-review briefly where we are so far, in case you missed the others or in case you forget. As Esther is an awesome book because it's one of only two books that are named after women, the other one being the book of Ruth. But Esther is unique because it is only one of two books in the Bible where God isn't mentioned. The other one being Song of Solomon. And the Song of Solomon is unique because it's a poetic love poem between Solomon and his girlfriend, soon to be his wife, Bathsheba. I mean, not Bathsheba. What is it? Anyway, anyway, it's a love poem, and so the Lord isn't mentioned there. But Esther's a unique book because it's almost as if the author went out of his way to exclude God. Not only is God not in there, but the king of the Persian Empire, named Ahasuerus, is mentioned by name or title 200 times. And the book only has 170 verses. So not only is God excluded, but this pretty poor quality king is mentioned on average more than once per verse. And so the question is God in the book of Esther? And this is what I ask each time I come up here. I said, he doesn't seem to be here. Now I'll give you a little tidbit that I wasn't going to share until the last message, which Lord willing will be the next message on as we finish Esther. But in a sense, God is in the book of Esther. First of all, by 4 acrostics. Now, acrostics are things that poets use and sometimes authors use. It's a way of kind of hiding little messages in phraseology. And so, like if I actually wrote down I made up my own acrostic, and I said, in this sentence, the hostess set out lots of red dishes to adorn the table. The hostess set out lots of red dishes to adorn the table. Well, the phrase lots of red dishes, if you take the first letter of each one of those, it spells out Lord, Lord. So I've kind of hidden the Lord in that phrase that you wouldn't even notice it. In the Hebrew Bible, in the book of Esther, there are 4 places where the name of the Lord, sometimes we pronounce it Yahweh, and in English characters, YHWH, are hidden the same way. And so the Lord's name is hidden in phrases 4 times in the book of Esther. And so the question is, does that happen a lot in Scripture? And I have to say, I don't know. Is that the only way we see God in the book of Esther? And I will leave that for your for your uh, thoughts. Uh, I'm going to use the word lucky a lot as we go through the book of Esther. I'm going to say, wasn't this lucky or wasn't this unlucky? And that's intentional. Personally, if you know me, you know I don't uh, believe in luck or fate or karma or chance. But I'm going to use that because since God isn't mentioned in this book, I'm going to throw in the word lucky, and we're going to see, was Esther lucky or was someone else unlucky? Was this event just lucky or was it unlucky? And I hope that you will see that perhaps God is in Esther more than just four acrostics. If you remember the story, King Ahasuerus has this massive empire. He's in essence the king of the world. His empire, his capital is in Shushan in Iran, in today's Iran, and you can go visit the ruins there. But for his empire is massive because from Shushan he can go 3,000 miles eastward through what is now Iraq and Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. So his empire went 3,000 miles east. And then to the west and southwest, it went through the Middle East and Saudi Arabia and Egypt, and then south in Africa through the Sudan and Ethiopia. So we're talking 6,000 mile spread of land. He's an incredibly powerful man. He's not a good man, though, and he's kind of a foolish man. I've told you this story, and I like to tell it. He got mad at the Mediterranean Sea one day because the storm messed up his plans. So he sent his soldiers out into the sea to whip the ocean with whips, to punish it, and then to take red hot pokers and poke the ocean with the red hot pokers. This is the kind of mentality the man has, and the kind of impetuousness he is, and the kind of foolishness he is. So when he got mad at his queen, he demoted her and got rid of her, just as an impetuous little thing. And he was foolish in that sense. And then after he had gotten rid of his queen for a while, he remembered that she was gone. He got a little depressed. So his advisors suggested that he have young, beautiful virgins brought from all 127 provinces, so 3,000 miles to the east, 3,000 miles to the west and the south, and to collect young virgins to bring to him, and then he can spend a night with each one and decide which one he wants to make king. What a horrible man this is, that he would pull these poor girls. And imagine, in a society at this time, these young virgins would probably have been 16, 17, 18 years old. We're not talking about what you would call mature women. These are young girls. And he's ripping them out of their societies, out of their families, against their will, probably. There may have been a few that thought was an adventure, but I would think majority of them were unhappy. To satisfy his own lust, he's pulling these hundreds of girls to find a queen. And he uses them one night and then throws them into his concubines, into his house of concubines. What a selfish, obnoxious man he was. At the end of this event of looking for a queen, Esther, who's a Jew, who lives in Shushan, is with her. He's actually a cousin named Mordecai, who is old enough to be her father. He actually has adopted her because her parents are dead. Kind of like my Uncle Roy was theoretic, not he was actually my cousin, but I called him my Uncle Roy because he was my dad's age. And so Mordecai was an older man, probably the same age as her parents. He had adopted her. But as the king is collecting all these young girls, scripture goes and tells us that Esther was beautiful. And so the king pulls her in and he chooses her as his queen. And at the end of chapter 2, there's this little story that almost seems as if it's just a footnote, because Mordecai finds out that there are two guys who are trying to assassinate the king. He tells Esther. Esther tells the king. The king finds out it's true, and so he has these two guys executed. And that story seems to come and go and have no value whatsoever. And it's kind of forgotten. The story then goes on to say that originally King Ahasuerus had 7 advisors, but at this time he decides to choose one man named Haman, who's going to be human. We don't know what happened to the other 7 advisors, if they're still around, but Haman is the number 2 man. Now, interestingly, Haman is an Agagite from the Amalekites. The Amalekites in the Old Testament, when Israel went on their exodus, the Amalekites attacked Israel, and Israel and God cursed the Amalekites and their king Agag. And years later, when Saul came along, Saul defeated the Amalekites, and ultimately Agag was killed. Haman's an Agagite. Mordecai, not only is he a Jew, he's a descendant of Saul. So that you could see this tension potentially between these two men. And on top of that, though he's the number 2 man, Haman does not get the respect from Mordecai that he expects, that he wants. And so he hates Mordecai. He knows Mordecai is a Jew, and he even goes so far as to say, not only do I want to get rid of Mordecai, I'd like to kill all the Jews. And so he starts throwing dice. We don't know initially why he's throwing dice, but he's throwing dice. And eventually he throws dice and he picks the 12th month of the year. And after that, we find out what he's going to do with that information. He goes to the king, and remember, our king here is not particularly intelligent or wise or level-headed. And he says, there's this group of people who are, they're troublesome, they're a problem. I'd like to get rid of them. I'll even give you some money to help you get rid of them. And the king, not even thinking as we expect from him, says, well, do whatever you want. So Haman writes this letter to all 127 provinces, all 6,000 miles of land. And he writes it and says, on the 12th month, remember this is early, this is the first month. On the 12th month, all the Jews can be killed. And if you kill the Jews, you can keep all their stuff. What an incredible inspiration for bad people. Not only do it's not so much killing the Jews, which is probably not that impressive, but you get to keep their stuff. He has created this squad of almost Nazi-like people who are going to go out and kill as many Jews as they can, and everything they kill, all the property those people had, becomes theirs. It's a happy day because all these people will be rich. Haman will get rid of all the Jews, and he will be a happy boy. The Jews were not slaves at this time. The reason we make that assumption is because later on Esther mentions the fact that they are not slaves. But if they were slaves, this kind of an edict wouldn't work, because the owners of the Jewish slaves would say, hey, you're not going to kill my slaves. They're my slaves. They work for me. Plus, as slaves, they would have nothing of value. So the Jews were dispersed over all 127 provinces, and they probably were merchants and farmers. They probably had all sorts of good stuff. And that's what made it encouraging for this edict to be followed, because now people can kill them and take their stuff. And I know I'm giving you a long lead in, but that's important because I want to catch up to where we're going to be today. This, of course, creates a lot of fear and terror to the people of Israel, to the Jews spread out. They know they got 11 months, and this one day they could be potentially wiped out. The whole nation, the whole empire could rise up that day, wipe them out because they've got good stuff, and people are going to want it and take it away. Mordecai is, not to be clever, but he's horrified, and he puts sackcloth and ashes on. And Esther, who has never told anyone she's a Jew, remember she's the queen, has never told anybody because Mordecai told her, don't tell anybody you're a Jew. She wants to find out why her uncle's all dressed up in sackcloth and ashes. So he tells her what's going on. He says, you need to go talk to the king and get this taken care of. And Esther says, well, uncle, he hasn't seen me for 30 days. And there's a law that if I just walk into the king, even as the queen, if he doesn't raise his scepter, I will be killed immediately, because that's how the king is protected from assassins. So she said, I can't just go and walk in on the king. And Mordecai says, you better do it, because this is to save your people and yourself. What I love about Esther, we don't know how old she is. This is, I think, the 5th year that she's the queen. So let's say she might be anywhere between 20 and 23 years old. So she's still a young girl. She's a queen, a young girl. She's facing potential instantaneous death. And when Mordecai says, you need to go in there, she says, if I perish, I perish. This girl's got incredible, not only courage, but um, a sense of duty, obedience to her uncle, obedience are the benefit of her people. And she says, if I do it, I mean, if I perish, I perish. It reminds me of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego when they faced the fiery furnace and they said, God can keep us from being killed, but if he doesn't, we still won't worship your God that he doesn't. And so Esther basically says the same thing. She says, I'll do it, but if I perish, I perish. She walks into the king. And now, I forget if I told you this, but she hasn't seen him for 30 days. Remember, he's got hundreds of concubines. Maybe he's a little tired of her, and maybe he's using these other girls. And so for some reason, he hasn't called her, and she's apprehensive. So she walks in not knowing what's going to happen. And scripture says she obtained favor. What I like about this particular verse is because in the book of Daniel, when Daniel obtained favor with his captors, it specifically says God made Daniel favorable in their sight. God was inspiration, or was the input to the favor that Daniel had. In the book of Esther, 3 times it says that she found favor, but it doesn't say how she got it. Was she lucky? Well, what do you think? Or was God there? Well, she found favor with the king. She walks in and he spares her life. And she says to him, King, I've got a problem. And when he sees her, not only does he save her life, but he says, what do you want, Esther? You can have half my kingdom. I mean, talk about overreaction. He hasn't talked to her for 30 days. He sees her. Not only does he spare her life, but he says, Esther, I'll give you half of my kingdom. And she says, well, what I'd really like is for you and Haman to come to a banquet this afternoon. And so the king says, okay, we'll do that. And he calls Haman and says, we're going to a party, just you, me, and Esther. So they go. And Esther at the party says, the king again says to her, Esther, what do you want? And she said, I'd like you to come to a party tomorrow, and then I'll tell you what's going on. Just you and Haman again, come to a party tomorrow. I'll settle everything out. So Haman's excited. He's the number 2 man, and now the queen has had 2 parties, one today and one tomorrow, where only he and the king are invited. He is living high in the hog. He walks out the door and he sees that stinking Mordecai, who will not respect him and who does not show him honor, and he's furious. So he goes home, and you'd think he'd be happy, but he goes home, tells his wife, I got this party to go to tomorrow. It's the second party of 2 days. Only the queen has invited only the king and me. But as happy as I am, I can't stand it because this stinking Mordecai out there will not respect me. And so his wife and his friends are very helpful. And they said, well, here's what you do. You build a gallows 70 feet tall. I mean, you don't need a gallows 70 feet tall, but you build this massive gallows. And tomorrow, ask the king that you can hang Mordecai on it. So he's a happy boy. And so chapter 6 is where we're going to start. That's a long lead in, isn't it? And I'm sorry, I actually cut down a whole lot. But in case you don't remember the story or if you'd missed things, it's important. And so we'll go to chapter 6. Remember, at this point, the job of Haman is to go to the party. But before he goes to the party, he wants to go to the king and say, he needs permission. I'd like to hang Mordecai. And the king probably doesn't even know who Mordecai is, probably wouldn't care. He's already shown a lack of interest, a lack of knowledge. So I'm sure the king would have said, do whatever you want to do. He's already told him, you want to kill all the Jews? I don't care, that's fine. So if Haman comes in and says, I want to hang Mordecai, I'm sure the king would have said, I don't care, do whatever you want to do. But start verse 6. That night, what incredible timing. Is this luck or not? That night, the king could not sleep. So one was commanded to bring the book of the records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, the doorkeepers who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. Then the king said, "What honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" And the king's servants who answered, "Nothing has been done for him." So the king said, "Who's in the court?" And now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to suggest the king hang Mordecai on the gallows he had prepared for him. The king's servant said to him, "Haman is there, standing in the court." And the king said, "Let him come in." So Haman came in, and the king asked him, "What shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor?" Now Haman thought in his heart, "Who would the king delight to honor more than me?" And Haman answered the king, "For the man whom the king delights to honor, let a royal robe be brought which the king has worn, a horse on which the king has ridden, which has a royal crest placed on its head. Then let his robe and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the most noble princes, that he may array the man whom the king delights to honor. Then parade him on horseback through the city square and proclaim before him, 'Thus shall be done to the king, to the man whom the king delights to honor.'" Then the king said to Haman, "Hurry, take the robe and the horse that you suggested, and do so for Mordecai the Jew who sits within the king's gate. Leave nothing undone to all that you have spoken." So Haman took the robe and the horse, arrayed Mordecai, and led him on horseback through the city square and proclaimed before him, "Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." Afterward, Mordecai went back to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house, mourning and with his head covered. When Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that happened to him, his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, "If Mordecai, before whom you begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you who will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him." While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs came and hastened to bring Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. What incredible time. The king has insomnia. Now, when I have insomnia, sometimes I just lie in bed. Lately, the last few weeks, I've been going over the verses we've been memorizing as a group. Sometimes I'm preparing this message. Sometimes I'm thinking about things at work. Sometimes I get up and I shave sometimes at 3 o'clock in the morning just to do something. And rarely I'll go upstairs and play on the internet, but then that gets me too riled up watching stupid stuff. So I generally don't do that. But I don't get to call Diane and say, "Diane, I'm not sleeping very well. Why don't you read me something?" Well, the king does that. Now, here's the great luck of this part of the story. He could have said, "I've got insomnia. I've got a house full of concubines. I'll just go find one of them. And that's how I'll spend my evening." But no, he, by luck, says, "I think I'll have somebody read to me because I'm not sleepy." So the guys, the librarian or whatever you want to call him, goes and gets some scroll. How he picks particular scroll, very lucky. And then he opens the scroll and he happens to read this story about Mordecai and how he saved the king's life. Very lucky to pick just that very special story. And just think of the timing, because remember what Haman's going to come and ask? He's going to say, "I'd like to hang Mordecai tomorrow." And so the king's reading how Mordecai had saved the king's life. And as the king ponders this, perhaps Haman's out there early in the morning, late at night, wandering around in the courtyard, waiting for the king to wake up. I don't know, but I don't know if the king sees him or hears him. But he says, "Who's out there in the courtyard?" And somebody says, "Oh, it's Haman." He says, "Oh, I'll let him come in." And before Haman can open his mouth and say, "Well, good morning, Your Majesty. I just have a simple request. I'd like to hang Mordecai." Before he even gets anything out of his mouth, the king says, "Haman, what should the king do for someone he wants to honor?" And Haman is so full of himself. He's the number two man. He has it makes some sense that he would think, "Well, I'm the number two guy. Who else is the king going to want to honor?" So he says, "Let's see, assuming it's me, what would I like? I'd like some bigwig to drag me around on a king's horse with the king's crown and his robes and proclaim how great I am." And so he comes up with this brilliant idea, and he tells the king, "Here's all the things I think you should do." And so the king says, "Do it to Mordecai." And the king also says, "The Jew." He even knows at this point that Mordecai is the Jew. He says, "Make sure you do it to Mordecai the Jew. I wish I could have heard the thoughts in Haman's brain. He was so close to asking for Mordecai's head. And the king now says, you take care of honoring this guy, Mordecai the Jew, the man who hates more than anything in the world. And so he does it. And interestingly, it says, Mordecai, when they're done, Mordecai goes back to where he was before, out by the king's gate. I mean, he had his moment, son, but he doesn't gloat about it. He just goes back to normal. Haman is an unhappy boy. He goes home. And his wonderful wisdom, his wonderful wise friends who yesterday had told him about hanging Mordecai, hear his story, and he is very sad. And oddly enough, his fair weather friends and fair weather wife, who yesterday were so excited about having Mordecai hanged, said, well, you know what, if you're kind of falling down before Mordecai, this might be the beginning of the end. And so in the midst of that horrible thought, the eunuchs come and say, Haman, it's time to go to the queen's party. And so he's had his up down, his up day, his down day. His life is just in turmoil now. Yesterday, he was the queen's only member of her party beside the king. And he has another party to go to with just the queen again and just the king. And in the midst of that happiness, he saw that stupid Mordecai that he hates with all his might. He's all excited about getting him killed and making his life much better. And yet, when he goes to the trouble to ask the king, he ends up honoring the man he hates the most. And suddenly, in the midst of this, the guys come and say, it's time to go to the queen's party. Chapter 7. If anyone in Hollywood had written this story as a story, people would say that's even more far-fetched than a fairy tale. But it's a great story. And maybe God is in this book. I don't know. You don't see him anywhere, but suddenly it seems like all these wonderful things are happening. Chapter 7. So the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther. And on the second day at the banquet of wine, the king said to Esther again, what is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Up to half the kingdom it shall be done. Then Queen Esther answered and said, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me as my petition, and my people at my request. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss. So King Ahasuerus answered and said to Queen Esther, who is he, and where is he who would dare presume such a thing in his heart? And Esther said, the adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. So Haman was terrified before the king and queen. Then the king rose in his wrath from the banquet of wine, went into the palace garden, but Haman stood before Queen Esther, pleading for his life, for he saw that evil was determined against him by the king. When the king returned from the palace garden to the place of the banquet of wine, Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was. Then the king says, will he also assault the queen while I'm in the house? As the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Now Harbona, one of the eunuchs, said to the king, look, the gallows 50 feet high, or 70 feet high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf, is standing at the house of Haman. Then the king said, hang him on it. And they hanged Haman on the gallows that he prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's wrath was subsided. The king has been in a very happy mood lately. Twice already he has offered, twice or three times, twice he's already offered Esther half his kingdom. This is the third time. So it wasn't just an emotional moment that he did that. This is the third time he says, Esther, what do you want? I'm here to make your wishes come true. And she says, oh, king, I'm not asking for half the kingdom. I'm asking for myself and for my people. And I like the phrase that she said, for we've been sold to be destroyed, to be killed, to be annihilated. Isn't that redundant? To be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. She's stressing her emotion on the destruction of her people. Now, the king, remember, he does not keep his mind is not really, he's not a thinker. And so he's already forgotten about that edict that Haman had sent out. And we're not even sure if he knew that the Jews were the ones that were going to be destroyed, because he had told Haman, yeah, whatever these bad people are, just take care of it. And Haman wrote all the edict up. So he may not have necessarily known that it was the Jews that were going to be destroyed. But Esther has now telling the king, these are my people. I'm a Jew. And there's this edict that all the Jews are going to be destroyed. All their stuff's going to be taken. And I'm pleading for my people. And when the king says, well, who is this? I can imagine Esther, because maybe at the moment Haman isn't catching on the fact that she's a Jew. She says, this wicked Haman is the problem. And the king blows up and exits. He's angry. And it says that Haman was terrified before the king and the queen, as he should be. And so he stands, it says initially that he's standing before the queen begging for his life. And perhaps she's not responding. I'm sure she's not responding. I don't know if she's ignoring him. But as his terror of his own life is on him, he throws himself on the couch where she is. And he forgot that she's the queen. He forgot his place is, she's royalty. He's a common, even though he's a number 2 man, he's not royalty. And he's thrown himself on her couch. And the king walks in. And Haman was not trying to do anything, wrong with the queen. But the fact that he's thrown himself in that familiar place onto her couch right in front of her when the king walks in, he responds. I don't know if he cooled off at all when he's outside. I don't know if there'd been hope for Haman if he'd just been lying on the ground begging for mercy. But when he was prostrate across Esther's couch, the king comes in and he explodes again. And a helpful eunuch says, oh, I've been reading Facebook, and Haman's been posting pictures of this big old 70-foot gallows. It's over at his house and nobody's using it. And that's all that this helpful eunuch says. And the king says, hang him on it. And they do. And and it almost seems like the story ends here. So is all well and good? Well, not so, boys and girls. There's still much yet to say. Now, I don't think I can do chapter 8 in 5 minutes. Huh? Well, if I read it fast, my mom will yell at me. We can read scripture. There's nothing wrong with reading scripture. We can do that even if nothing else happens after that. Chapter 8. On that day, again, things are happening very fast. The last part of Esther all happens within a very short period of time. And so on that day, King Ahasuerus gave Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, and Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told her how he was related to her. So the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed Mordecai over the house of Haman. Now Esther spoke again to the king, fell at his feet, implored him with tears to counteract the evil of Haman the Agagite and the scheme with which he had devised against the Jews. And the king held out the scepter before Esther. So Esther arose and stood before the king and said, if it please the king, and if I found favor in his sight, and the thing seemed right before the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to revoke the letters devised of Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite. And so I will tell you, in essence, that the rest of the chapter is the king saying, okay, you can do that. Now, one thing that we're told in chapter 1, and again here, is when these edicts were written in this crazy Persian Empire, they can't be undone. They can't be revoked. They can't be turned around. So once it's written into law, it's there forever. So they can't get rid of the law that says on that 13th day of the 12th month, you can kill the Jews and take their stuff. They can't get rid of it. What are they going to do? So they write a counter proposal, if you will. And the counter proposal is basically this. It says, all the Jews on that day are allowed to defend themselves. That's in essence. Now, I will tell you this, that people have been angry with the Jews because of this, because I've heard people say, well, that's revenge. And the law of God says, vengeance is mine, I will repay. God says, you don't take vengeance. Well, it's not a vengeance. They're not told that they can go kill anybody they want and take their. All this new edict says is that the Jews are allowed to defend themselves if they are attacked. So they can't get rid of the first law, but anybody who wants to attack the Jews now are facing people that are armed and ready and can defend themselves. And the results of this new law is in we'll pick up at verse 15. This new edict has gone out. These 127 provinces have it. It says at verse 16, the Jews had light and gladness, joy and honor in every province and city, wherever the king's command and decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a holiday. Then many of the people of the land became Jews because the fear of the Jews fell upon them. Isn't that lucky too? Not only do they get to defend themselves, but the fear of the Jews has come upon them, and many people became Jews. So is our story finally over? Well, not quite. We got 2 more chapters to go. And Lord willing, we'll finish that the next time. But this is an awesome story. And if you haven't figured it out yet, and I know you have, but all these lucky events are not lucky at all. Somebody is controlling all these things, but it's not Mordecai, it's not Esther, it's not clever people, it's someone else. And it has to be God, because the timing issues, the event issues, the sequence issues, the oddities, the things that we would say just can't happen. Of course, they can't happen by chance. They can't happen by luck. But God is in the book of Esther, if you haven't figured that out yet. He's not just hidden in the acrostics where his name is hidden in the middle of words and only there. He is visible and he's prominent in the book of Esther. He just doesn't go to the trouble of saying, I, the Lord, did this. Or neither does the author say, and God did this. He's there, he's still hidden, and he's still in control. And so Lord willing, we'll finish up the book of Esther next time, and we can enjoy it that God is always in control. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for this opportunity to be together. We thank you for this book, and even though some people have made negative statements about it over the decades and maybe over the centuries, because they think that because you're not mentioned, it's not your word, it's not worthy of study. We see you hidden everywhere. We see these events that just cannot happen by men and women's plans. And we see you protecting your people in unusual ways. And so as we look forward to finishing this book in your will, we just thank you for what we've seen so far. We thank you that even when we don't see you in our lives, particularly, we see you there, sometimes hidden. And so we thank you that you are always there, whether you're visible or whether you're hidden. And so we think too of our brothers and sisters who are going through ordeals right now. We think of the Talley family. We thank you again that our brother knew you. That's why we call him our brother. And so he's passed into glory. But as John mentioned, always people left behind are going to suffer. And so we just ask that you would remember them. We think of the people that are traveling. We think of the Powers. We think of Max going back to school. We think of other people traveling, perhaps back to school. And after spring break, we just ask your blessing on their travels. We think of the K-Wines too, with Perry's healing and Mary's coughing and her bouts going on. We think of my Diane, and we just ask for your help with her. And we just thank you that we can bring these things before you for those we love and care about. And we just look forward to spending more time in your book of Esther in your will as we depart now. We bring all these things before you in Jesus' name.